So what are we talking about today? Well, today we're going to be talking about MongoDB Atlas and managed community editions. I'm going to explain what I mean by that later on. And really the general theme for this talk is going to be how licensing changed the MongoDB landscape. Coming right off of the question in licensing, how is Percona server for MongoDB licensed? Currently, it's licensed under SSPL as well, but we'll get more into that in the presentation. So, wouldn't be fun if it didn't start controversial. So, I've heard SSPL is evil. Is that true? In my opinion, no. And the reason for this is really because MongoDB isn't the first, and they're not going to be the last company to really change licensing to fit what their core mission is. And really, if we look at the mission statement for MongoDB, it's to free the genius within everyone by making data stunningly easy to work with. Nothing about that says we want to be open source. Now, when you look at that mission statement, it's really easy to see that the path that Mongo has gone on in Atlas to make data stunningly easy to use. Now they're guarding their code base with SSPL, and what ends up happening is MongoDB being source available instead of open source doesn't make it good, doesn't make it evil, but it does force you to change. It changes the way that you think about deploying the database. It changes the way that you can use the database. And so let's talk a little bit about what database as a service is. So SSPL forced people to change DBaaS with MongoDB. And what do I mean by it forced them to change? It forced people to enter into a commercial licensing agreement with MongoDB. It forced people just not to offer MongoDB services or as a service. And so let's talk about what DBaaS is to understand how that affects the general market. And so IBM has a really good definition for DBaaS, in my opinion. It's a cloud computing service that lets users access and use a cloud database system without purchasing, setting up their own hardware, installing their own database software, or managing the databases themselves. The cloud provider takes care of everything from periodic upgrades to backups, ensuring that the database system remains available and secure 24/7. Now, this is what is taken away from the community explicitly with SSPL licensing. And what we really need to understand from the community editions is how does that affect people's ability to provide services and value add to MongoDB since it's no longer open source, right? It's source available with the caveat that you cannot use it as a service. So let's talk a little bit about managed services. Managed services is the practice of outsourcing responsibility for maintaining, anticipating needs, and a range of processes and functions in order to improve operations and cut expenses. It's a really long way to say we'll run it for you. So DBaaS happens to be a subset of managed services under the larger umbrella of managed services. And the litmus test for whether you're subscribing to a managed service or a database as a service is really as simple as these 5 things. Do you own the hardware that you're deploying the database on? Chances are if you own it, it's more of a managed service than it is a database as a service. There's always a shared responsibility model. So do you have full unrestricted access to the hardware that you own? If the answer is yes, you're most likely dealing with a managed service, not a database as a service. The tooling is not needed to run the database. So if the tooling that whatever subscription or whatever service provider installs on your systems is removed, MongoDB will still run. That is a really good litmus test of whether or not you're dealing with managed services or a database as a service. Are there hands-on to the database, not setting up the database? A really good indicator that you're on a managed service. And then expertise is what you're paying for, and not MongoDB in a licensing fashion is a very strong indicator that you're using managed services as well. So let's talk about community editions. Licensing gets a bit confusing when we talk about MongoDB because of the change. So Percona Server for MongoDB and MongoDB's Community Edition were both AGPL prior to October 16th, 2018, whenever the licensing changed to SSPL. And now currently, there are two editions that are source available, and those are MongoDB Community Edition, which is SSPL licensed, and then Percona Server for MongoDB, which is also SSPL licensed. I do get into the kind of branches of support and some of the things that you can do with the AGPL version. That licensing is not retroactive, so that license applies to all versions of that software before October 16th, 2018. Another really important point to consider is, are you choosing a technology platform or are you buying into an ecosystem? And what do those two things mean? A technology platform is something that you leverage to create value on top of. And it's not typically a choice made from a licensing decision. It uses features and functionality core to the database software itself. And so that's more of the technology angle. Then you have the ecosystem angle, where it's more for enablement. It allows you to do more if you use an ecosystem and the deeper that you get into that ecosystem. So for database as a service particularly, and managed services particularly, it's important to understand whether you're choosing the technology or whether you're choosing the ecosystem. And with that, let's talk about Atlas. Atlas is in a unique position to provide both a technology platform and an ecosystem. And they did this intentionally with the SSPL licensing. So they are allowed to leverage custom things that MongoDB can only do, and then leverage that as providing an ecosystem for you to have an experience that's controlled by MongoDB. Well, I'm not going to get too deep into the internals of the enterprise editions or the proprietary versions of Mongo and what the differences are. But as far as the ecosystem is concerned, there is some unique functionality in Atlas that's not in any other edition of MongoDB, and that happens to be Atlas Search, MongoDB Realm integrations, that they're tightly coupled in the Atlas world. Atlas's data lake, the RESTful API that's available through Atlas, and then the fully managed BI connector instead of having to manage it yourself. So those are pretty unique value propositions that Atlas has bundled together to really solve the problem of making data really easy to use. What does that come with? And so any database as a service provider, MongoDB included, is going to now have your data on their servers. And I say it's secured. We have not had any breaches from MongoDB's infrastructure. They use data at rest encryption. You have many choices to secure your data, and that is also a shared responsibility. So have there been some people who didn't set a password in their Atlas instances? Of course. Is that MongoDB Inc.'s purview? Absolutely not. They should tell you, and they do in fact tell you in the dashboard, if you're running in a vulnerable state. I just want to make sure that MongoDB doesn't own your data, but they do own all of the infrastructure that your data now resides on. And that can be said for any database as a service provider. So you can't really have custom replica sets or shard options. So if you are running in kind of a non-vanilla way that's intended by MongoDB, let's say that you have incongruent shards and some are bigger, some are smaller. That's not really what Atlas allows for you to do. You should deploy everything in 3 node replica sets per shard and grow and scale that way. It is commercially licensed. It is API compatible with the Community Edition, so you can leave. You're not held hostage, and I don't think the intention of Atlas is to ever hold anybody hostage. You don't have any control over the binaries except for version. And what I mean by this is if you wanted to alter the code for your use case, you're unable to do that. Also, if there's a bug or something that is affecting your use case specifically, That hotfix or bug fix resides in the responsibility model on MongoDB's engineering team to deploy that fix for you. And then there's not any features outside of those included by MongoDB that you can leverage on an Atlas type platform. So what are the caveats to moving into Atlas? Well, seamless is only on the way into Atlas. If you're trying to leave Atlas, it is not very easy and not very seamless. You can't just add a node to the replica set and then step down and promote that primary outside of Atlas. That is much the functionality that you have on the way in, but the experience leaving is much different. As I said, growth is in increments of at least 3 node replica sets. If you're adding a new shard or a new replica set for high availability, you don't have the option of running multiple MongoDB services on a node for, let's say, a hidden replica super shard. That's not a thing. The base fee only gets you the database as a service. There are no services on top of that at all. So you have to pay more to get a really fully managed experience. The margin that is baked into the cost of Atlas scales linearly with instance size. So if you get a larger instance, the fee for Atlas is incrementally as large as your next jump to the next size up of instance. You can only deploy into one cloud, hybrid cloud model inside of a sharded replica set or within a replica set is not supported in Atlas. And then you can still be affected by stock.
Rick, can I ask you just to pause for a moment? It looks like we've been disconnected. Just one moment. Okay, I think we're back online. Sorry about that.
We're back.
We're back.
We're talking about stockouts and then it goes out. So you can still be affected by stockout if you have a sizable deployment or you're using an instance class that is fairly large. There are capacity limitations even with Atlas, and those are cloud provider based. There's no special sauce from being an Atlas or MongoDB subscriber to get more hardware access at a particular cloud. So let's talk about what else there is in the market and what SSPL really forced from a change perspective and how it affected the landscape. So really, there's 3 main pathways. There's public cloud, which has a compatibility layer or a compatible DBAS. And so public cloud's either hard forked an AGPL version or some type of MongoDB wire to create a compatibility layer, or they forged a partnership with MongoDB Inc. to offer it as a service. So they have a proprietary license that they use the community edition to essentially offer as a service. Then you have the polyglot expertise providers. So these are providers that are not exclusively focused on MongoDB as a technology, but almost all databases as a technology. And so they are delivering a managed service for those technologies. And then you have platform providers. They have really no focus on MongoDB or any of the technologies that they deploy, but they are solely focused on the automation and management of databases in general. So each of those has companies who commercially license from MongoDB to get around SSPL or having to share their source code. And so we'll get into some of those. Some of these cloud providers, I think you will know all of them. I've separated this into distinct sections to kind of discuss those. And one common thing that we see amongst all cloud providers is either the hard fork with some value-added services into an ecosystem that they've already created in their own cloud. And so they're trying to use the technology to bring you into their ecosystem. And so 2 really good examples, and the reason that this slide has 2 are these are the true hard forks that leverage and fully support at least one version of AGPL licensed MongoDB wire. And so what is the difference between these two and what makes them kind of special. So what DocumentDB from AWS does not have is compatibility beyond 3.6. It doesn't support transactions. It doesn't come with a lot of the new modern features that we've all come to expect from a MongoDB deployment. It is on AWS, so you can pay for it in the same project as the rest of your infrastructure. It's got a good API compatibility, especially in 3.6 versions for the CRUD. So MQL, Mongo Query Language, for just basic operations for insert, update, delete, those types of things is fully compatible here. So you get the same great things that from the developer enablement that Mongo Query Language enables, but it doesn't have any of those advanced features. So the throughput profiles are a lot more like Aurora than they are like MongoDB. So there's clearly something that they've changed. So the communication layer between the client and the server responds like MongoDB, but underneath the covers, I have serious doubts that it's even anything close to Wired Tiger. So Cosmos, what's going on there on Azure? So they chose two different wire protocols to emulate. Along with this, they emulated many other wire protocols for NoSQL databases. And Cosmos is distinctly not at all MongoDB. It does have compatibility with those wire protocols. What makes it special? It's a really flexible NoSQL solution. It's got dedicated throughput. They have guaranteed 99th percentile on query latency, and then it's globally distributed and has 5 nines of uptime. This is very much different than the value proposition positioned by MongoDB or many other managed service providers for that matter. It is a very unique solution, and it is something that they had to do substantial amounts of work to make compatible with a MongoDB wire protocol. Then we have Huawei's Cloud Document Database Service, DDS for short. Really, there's not a whole lot to talk about here other than it's an enhanced version of MongoDB. It does, in that enhanced version, have limitations that come with that enhanced performance. And then the reference documentation indicates that it's compatible with 3.4. We're really unsure from Percona's perspective and in general how this moved forward after the license change and then after the US government got involved in Huawei operations in general. I did want to put it in here because it is available and on the marketplace, and it is one of the major cloud providers. Then we have IBM Cloud Databases for MongoDB. We also have Compose alongside that. They attack the market in similar but different ways, and both are owned by IBM. The important thing to note here is that they are just running MongoDB Community Edition, and it has a tight integration with the IBM Cloud. So you get a lot of the great care and feeding, all of the things that you would expect from a DBaaS, but nothing really more on top of that. So they do some automation things, they make deployment easy, and then you have Mongo running in a way that is advantageous to you and your organization in IBM's cloud. There's not much else to say there. Then we start to get into Alibaba's Opsera DB for MongoDB. What they do and the strategy that they took is gaining a proprietary license from MongoDB so that they could make some significant changes to the database itself and the code base itself. So not only it would perform better on their cloud and optimize for their cloud, they also added some additional functionality and features that make it easier to use within the Alibaba ecosystem. So they also support other storage engines outside of those available in Atlas, in RocksDB and TerraRchDB, which is a fork of RocksDB that's fully compatible. And so that opens up a lot of scenarios that were previously unavailable in the market. And as I mentioned, they have a very tight integration with the rest of their services, and migrations from a MongoDB instance in Alibaba to Opsera DB for MongoDB. They've done substantial amounts of work to make geo-replicated clusters. They have a great project called MongoShake that leverages a lot of these. So moving on to the Polyglot service providers. And so the common theme between all of these service providers is they're selling expertise and a general management platform, not specifically MongoDB. This is, of course, focused on the MongoDB flavor, but keep in mind that these services are typically available for a lot more than just MongoDB. So who's first? I had a hard time deciding whether to put Object Rocket in the cloud part or the Polyglot part, mainly because of being owned by Rackspace and having a deployment methodology that is very similar to what a cloud provider has in a database as a service. But they do operate on any cloud and on any infrastructure. So I decided that they fit more into the Polyglot mentality. They have a unique approach where they have a proprietary license for community editions so that they can get around the SSPL to offer great value-added services on top of MongoDB, the community edition. They also leverage Percona Server for MongoDB as a source available license without having to pay us anything. And they unlock all of the API compatibility and enterprise features that come with those versions. So they have a very flexible model, and they can work with any version of MongoDB that's currently available, which was unique. It is closest to MongoDB's Atlas Platinum offering. So Platinum gets you a lot of the great hands-on things that you think with traditional managed services, and that's just the base service offering at Object Rocket. And they also have a rich RESTful API, and they use expertise to get you into the right technology instead of just using technology to kind of lock you in. And that's a really unique value proposition that they're bringing to the general market for managed MongoDB. And Kimberly, I'm going to have you cameo in. Kimberly used to work at Object Rocket. Is there anything you would like to add here? Nope, moving on. So moving on to Pythians, managed services for MongoDB. They have a unique approach to the general market in managed services when it comes to databases. They're not focused on a particular license category. They don't really care what the technology is. They are really, it's called love your data. And they look at proprietary solutions, they look at source available solutions, they look at open source solutions. So they use everything that's available to them from a licensed perspective, an unlicensed perspective, and they can take that and run with it, which is also unique as a value proposition because they can use tools and licensing that you bring, or they can bring their own depending on your level of service with them. They also are very, very flexible in their engagement, which is unusual from a managed services provider. So they can be almost hands-off in nature as a managed services provider, or all the way hands-on as far as Platinum and Object Rocket get. The thing to note here is they are completely infrastructure agnostic. So that means you can deploy anywhere on any version of MongoDB that they support. And then we'll talk about Percona a little bit. So what do we do at Percona and what makes us a little bit unique in this space? We are committed and focused purely on open source and, in MongoDB's case, source available databases. So everything that we write is going to follow an open source mentality first. And then, and we kind of have to layer in source available. We can use any binary out there that is source available or open source, including older versions of Percona Server or MongoDB. So we are completely agnostic when it comes to, are you running MongoDB? If the answer is yes, then we can augment that expertise with expertise. Another unique thing that Percona does is we can fix the code base or change the code base depending on use case for our customers. So if you have us run your Mongo for you and we need to patch something, that patch is controlled by Percona, or we can take in community patches. So we are, independent of upstream for MongoDB, and through the managed services, you can also have custom builds as well. We use an open source management platform. So SSPL doesn't necessarily affect us, although it is not SSPL licensed. PMM is available, and it is completely customer driven. So a unique thing here is we're building the database for the community, not for a profit. We give away free software. That's what we do here at Percona. And again, we are completely infrastructure agnostic. And so you can deploy anywhere, and that's what we're bringing to the space. So we'll move on to the platform providers. And what's important to understand about the platform providers is it's a unique take on solving the problem of MongoDB DBaaS, or the licensing issue with SSPL, because they're focused purely on providing almost an as-a-service like experience, but in a way that works with the SSPL licensing so that they can have a commercial product. So the first of those providers is ScaleGrid for MongoDB. So they have three different models. They have a cloud model, an on-premise model, or a hosted experience. The asterisk up there is to indicate that they have a commercial partnership with MongoDB to be able to provide that hosted experience. The same platform is leveraged for the on-premise and the hosted experience with some minor modifications, and that enables them to not have to open source that or make it source available. They leverage MongoDB's Community Edition through the normal installation pathways, and it's a really similar experience to the base Atlas experience, but only for the Community Edition. So you don't have things like LDAP authentication, data at rest encryption, all of those great enterprise features. Those are not on ScaleGrid for MongoDB. They also do offer other databases. So Redis, Postgres, Elasticsearch, those types of things are also available for deployment on ScaleGrid. And then we have several nines and how they approach the MongoDB problem. So they allow you to use any binary for deployment. So you can use Percona Server for MongoDB. You can use an AGPL version of MongoDB's Community Edition. You can use the latest version of the SSPL MongoDB Community Edition. The several nines platform essentially obfuscates themselves from that and allows you to have a deployment pattern that you control. The free version is available forever. It is commercially licensed, but it is free forever. It is not a trial. The paid version is comparable to a roll your own Atlas, but just the base version with no additional support, functionality, or managed services, hands-on support. And several nines also supports MySQL and Postgres and MariaDB. So let's talk about Kubernetes because everybody is talking about Kubernetes. Kubernetes could be the DBaaS killer. Is it the DBaaS killer? I'm going to answer that currently. No, it's not. Right now, data on Kubernetes is still fairly immature. It is in a maturation cycle, and the more eyes that are on it, the faster that maturation cycle will happen. It is, however, appropriate for some workloads. So smaller workloads, a lot of microservices, things like that, I think are a great use case for Kubernetes and MongoDB. It is worth noting that Kubernetes is not built to replace something like anything as a service, including databases as a service. What it does is it obfuscates your ability to deploy on any infrastructure kind of regardless of where it is or what it is. And so the Kubernetes operator experience will be similar in some ways to a database as a service with things like automatic backups and uptime and the care and feeding of the general binary database. But it really, at its core, is just a database with self-healing and autonomous deployment. So there is operators available. from MongoDB or Percona that are widely used. Both the MongoDB Inc. and Percona versions are open source. There's also a proprietary licensed operator that MongoDB Inc. leverages that does use Ops Manager inside of it. So it's not really the Kubernetes way. It just happens to run MongoDB in Kubernetes with Ops Manager. So the focus on the open source Kubernetes operators is to do it the Kubernetes way. And what that means is to use all of the native APIs and no non-native functionality. And so, again, those are available both from MongoDB and Percona. Just shedding some tears for some people who just maybe didn't make the cut or got gobbled up by the mothership. And so M Clusters was a company out of Dallas that was providing a really cost-effective way to run MongoDB in the cloud. They are no longer offering any services because of the SSPL license issues. And then MLab was, the shining beacon of hope while MongoDB was AGPL. They have since been acquired by MongoDB and are in the process of migrating their customer base in a seamless way to Atlas. So it's still a value-added service, but they are focusing, that development team has transitioned to MongoDB, and they are now focused solely on Atlas and the cloud database as a service that MongoDB has. So how does your choice affect the community at large when it comes to using Atlas or using one of the managed community editions? And I want to be clear that Percona will always be committed to providing a source available version of MongoDB that's fully compatible with upstream. I'm not going to speak for Object Rocket, Pythian, and a few other companies, but we know that the sentiment is shared across the board from many service providers. We make a lot of code commitments. We make a lot of feature development that is not included in upstream or merged with upstream. However, sometimes MongoDB does take a great idea that Percona had and then builds that into the community edition. And so really, if you choose Atlas, it's choosing proprietary over open source or source available in this case. So the more that we get use out of the community editions, the more feature rich the community editions will be, because that will drive adoption. And so in the end, the choice really needs to be yours on where you want that innovation to happen. If you're perfectly content in Atlas and you think, hey man, this would be really cool if they added more features here, then it's appropriate to use Atlas. If you think, hey, I really want the community edition to be better, then using the community edition and having a partner, whether it's Percona or not Percona, one of the many others that I mentioned here, it's very good for the community edition for it to be driven as an adoption. So what about the small people and the small deployments that have a really small data footprint or small throughput footprint? I think that Atlas provides an incredible value there, especially in their free tier, all the way up to the M10 tier is really value packed. You get a lot, you get a big bang for your buck, you get a lot of value on the lower end there. I do recommend that you always have a plan and you always have offsite backups if you're a small use case, because it is easy to take a Mongo dump and have that stored somewhere else and not just leverage MongoDB's backup technology. Because in the event that you don't want to pay for that value-added service, or that you grow out of the value-packed tier at the lower end, you have options. So always have a plan, especially if you're on the small side, to get away from any database as a service provider, not just Atlas. And then I'm going to hand it over to Kimberly.
Great, thanks very much. There we go. Hi, everybody. I'm Kimberly Wilkins. I recently joined Percona. Always worked a lot with with Percona throughout the years and the times, but it's been a pleasure to come on board and really enjoying it. And Percona's really got a lot of things going on. So to go back to the presentation itself, you know, Atlas is kind of ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's, you know, pretty much everything that you see. And they, like Rick said, they've really done a great job of offering one place for you to go and get everything. They've got here the data lake now. They've improved their search. They've added Realm for mobile capabilities. And so they can really take you and help you do that right there. But the problem with that is that when you did, what are your options? You're no longer going to have options. If Atlas is everywhere, then they're doing a great job of it. But what if you don't want to do that? What if you want to pick and choose certain components? What if you want to use a different data warehouse? What if you don't want to use S3 for your data lake? So there's quite a bit of opportunity there to go play with that. So, and so then that takes us to, you know, the next slide. What about your options? You have a lot of options, okay? So if you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, as the proverbial saying goes, what if you don't want to get locked into a vendor, right? What if you have a problem with just one vendor having everything, and then your licensing prices continue to increase? We've seen how, you know, Oracle has done that in the past, and even, you know, there's a slight take around anything that has a similar type of pricing type schedules. So no eggs in all the one basket. But you do have options, right? You have the option that you can roll your own, and that gives you the ability right there to use something such as Percona, server for MongoDB. It's based on the community edition, but it has some additional improvements that enterprise has. So we've all talked about that. We're pretty clear about that as well. But there are other things that you can use too. Having the options and doing something similar outside, you can use other tools. So for example, you can use Snowflake or Redshift or whatever else as your data warehouse. And there are tools such as Fivetran connectors. We currently have 150 plus connectors that you can use to take data from Mongo, put it into Postgres, or take data from Mongo and put it into the S3 on your own. So there are different things that you can do there. You don't have to worry about that. You know, vendor lock-in is a real thing. So different sides of the coin there for you to go with, but vendor cloud provider, you don't have to do that. And so then that's where all your options are. Open source options do exist that you can work with, right? For example, obviously Percona server for Mongo. So then that takes us to the next one, the next slide that we have. And then flexibility. So we talked about options, flexibility, right? And then performance in the end. What's in your cluster? When you're working with Atlas, you say upscale, auto scale. Okay, great, let's add another host. So you add another host, you know what you're getting in terms of RAM, you know what you're gonna get in terms of CPUs, but how old are these servers? When were they purchased? You select the size, they're gonna give you whatever they want. So you're getting your resources, but you're getting whatever. AWS, Google, all the other main providers are allowing you to change to the newer servers. So you can get better CPUs, faster cores. You can get more increased speed in your storage as well. So NVRAM, SSDs, you know, the bare metal instances. So you can get a lot more if you're kind of rolling your own, latest and greatest, okay? So that's kind of depicts this here. And then the other thing is more and more companies are talking about open cloud. More and more companies are talking about multi-cloud as the option. So you've got multi-cloud going. Why would you want multi-cloud? AWS goes down occasionally, or one of the other providers goes down occasionally. So if you really want to hedge your bets and be prepared for something that happens, more companies are looking to do multi-cloud. They want to put part of their infrastructure on, for example, on Google. Google spent a lot of money there, or even on Azure. So those things are happening. So then that takes us to the final thing, right? Why is the difference maker? Okay, your final thing, expertise and community spirit. Those are the difference makers. And what that really means is this, and Rick talked about this earlier again, with Atlas, you've got everything you need right there. And they've made it incredibly easy to auto scale. But there are a couple of negatives around auto scaling. Auto scaling is not always the solution. And the reason for that is if you have auto scaling on, you run into some kind of performance problem, you need more resources to get you through this hump, and then you have a big push or a big campaign out for your business, and you auto scale more up, and you keep going up, you keep growing, but you're not fixing the underlying problems. A prime example of this is related to shard keys. If you haven't done your shard key correctly, you can really run into some performance problems. And indexing is another big thing. If you have indexes that are in place that are not being used, they're just size splitting. So you just keep adding data, you keep having to update the index, and you're going to impact your performance. You can keep throwing RAM at it, but then you're really no different than the Oracle vendor lock-in or the Exadata type situation from past. So horizontal scaling, the expertise, you need that to do. It's great. Atlas is great. If you're a startup, you have no resources whatsoever. But once you reach a certain size, once your application hits a complexity level, then you're going to need some expert advice. You're going to need help from people who actually know and have worked with Mongo. So that you don't end up with a problem here. You want superheroes. You don't want the machine fixing another machine. And you really want to not end up paying entirely too much money or too many servers that you don't need. So that's pretty much it. You know, like those are the things to really, really think about. You want to have options, you want flexibility, you want expertise. And another thing around the options, when I'm talking about options too, Percona Server for Mongo also has Percona Monitoring Management, PMM, and the Percona Backup Server. So, and we just had some updates today, going out today for those that you guys want to take a look at, some fixes. You can use other tools besides Atlas's monitoring and built-in things, and monitor more things and try to find those problems down at the lower skill level that you might not have the opportunity. And so really that's just a couple of thoughts that I had around this to kind of help. And I'm going to hand it back over to Rick now. But thank you guys.
Thanks, Kimberly. And you bring up a really important point that I wanted to touch on. And it's that these expertise providers are able to provide expertise even if you are on Atlas. So you can still have some of that community addition and what the community brings to MongoDB by leveraging, you know, ObjectRocket, Pythian, Percona, some of these companies that their mission is outcome based for the customer and in delivering expertise on a product that's available in the community. And, you know, those use cases will help further drive the open source or source available additions as well.
Yes, thanks for that, Rick.
Well, did I skip? Okay, yeah. So we've talked a lot about Atlas and the other options today. Is it bad? I think that, that there's two answers to this, and it depends on what your temperature is or what your moral compass is when it comes to open source software. I think Atlas is a great solution for people who want a proprietary solution because that's exactly what it is. MongoDB is turning MongoDB into a proprietary solution with Atlas. And the future roadmap is dictated mostly by their revenue and where their customers reside, which is in Atlas. So I think you can see where I'm going with this. The freemium model that their CEO says that the source available unlocks for them, I believe is diminishing in value. And, you know, in the future, potentially we could see a full change to a proprietary license in MongoDB once Atlas has enough adoption. And then we're left with essentially the only option is commercially licensed so that you can work on MongoDB or use MongoDB's stuff themselves. Not a bad business use case, but bad for the community. From an open source perspective, there's not really much to say about Atlas except don't use it, right? Well, bye. If from your perspective in open source, you want a tool, especially a NoSQL document database, MongoDB probably shouldn't be on your future roadmap, and you should be thinking about what you're going to do next. There's a lot of NoSQL and NewSQL options out there. This presentation isn't to go over those, but it is really good for and healthy for those communities to have more adoption if we are looking for an open source solution. So if that's your goal, I would really strongly suggest that you look at those projects instead of just one day hoping that Mongo is going to become open source again or aligned with open source ideals. And so I want to, as a final call out, I want to call the community to action. You can, go contribute to MongoDB. They have a pretty lengthy contributor agreement where they own everything that you do for them. And then they'll just go and turn that into a proprietary license. Or you can use, one of the Percona's many available ways to interact with our community, from our forums, from emailing our community team, asking how you can help out, from presenting at Percona Live, to actually contributing to our projects that are fully open source and available on both GitHub and Jira. So I would really, really strongly suggest that the MongoDB community kind of steps up and makes the source available version of MongoDB as attractive or more attractive than Atlas, and gives everybody who's a player in this industry a chance to show how great of a technology platform that MongoDB is, instead of just letting MongoDB dictate what their technology can do. And please, if you can, attend Percona Live online. I know that we're about to finish up for today, but I do want to recommend, if you liked what you saw today in my talk or any of the other talks, we've got a lot more where that came from in October.